Hello, I'm Lisa Kathleen Graddy, and I'm a curator here at the National Museum of American History's Political History Collection. And I should add, if for all of you who've enjoyed watching Richard Curran's talk on the Star-Spangled Banner, that incredible gantry and that chamber that held the flag, when the flag moved out, women moved in. And the First Lady's collection, a version of the First Lady's exhibit during as construction of the museum was ending, was the next thing in that chamber. As I said, I'm Lisa Kathleen Graddy. I'm a curator with the museum's Political History Collection. And the Political History Collection, while it's changed names any number of times over the years, it's essentially the part of the institution that earliest on was the preserver of national history and the continuing objects and narrative of American political and national history. And that really started when Abraham Lincoln's hat came to the Smithsonian, that hat that was left on the floor by his chair at Ford's Theater when it came to the institution in 1867. Now, I spend a good deal of my time, because I specialize in women's political history, thinking about how women have interacted with, have impacted, have influenced American politics and American democracy. So to me, it's always been absolutely thrilling to find that women had a really early hand in shaping the national collections and the exhibits that would be part of the National Museum. It's preserving the material culture of America. So, and I'm very lucky in that I am the curator of two of those 100-year-old collections. So in many ways, I feel as if I'm part of the continuing history of the institution, not just adding to the history of the institution. And that's a wonderful thing. So I hope that you enjoy the video that's going to come up, that's going to look at two of those collections, how they came to be, and how they've 100 years on are still shaping the institution. Now, the nice thing about taped conversations is that you can use the question and answer box to add in any questions or comments or just conversation points as they occur to you. I'll be looking at them at the end. And so type in whatever it is that you'd like to know more about or chat about. And as they say, as I've learned to say from obsessively watching news for the last year, we'll see you on the other side. According to my rough and extremely casual calculation, a little over half of the objects in the Political History Collection come from women. It makes sense. Women traditionally are keepers of memory and memorabilia, and many of the things that they treasure eventually found their way into the national collection. To be sure, those earliest donations centered on the lives of men. Encouraged by the historical interest sparked by the 1876 centennial celebrations and displays, descendants of George Washington's favorite granddaughter, Nellie Custis, offered the government their collection of memorabilia. It included furnishings, china, and silver from Mount Vernon, along with treasured relics like George Washington's christening robe. But objects representing women's lives came too, including Nellie's own guitar, a gift from her grandfather, and her grandmother's tea tray. In Julia Grant's large donation to the Smithsonian, artifacts recording Ulysses S. Grant's post-presidency world tour included a silver perfume house given to her by a Maharaja, a mark of respect to the First Lady as well as a president. The Washington and Grant material anchored history displays at the Smithsonian's Arts and Industries building. Rows upon rows of cases filled with artifacts, marking out the men that Americans should remember and revere. Elizabeth Custer was keenly aware of the significance of being included in the national narrative on display at the Smithsonian, and she was a fierce keeper of her late husband, General George Armstrong Custer's memory. In 1912, she brought the museum his buckskin jacket, the linen towel he had received as a flag of truce at Appomattox Court House, along with the table that Ulysses S. Grant used to draft the terms of surrender at Appomattox. The table was given to Elizabeth Custer as a gift by her husband's commanding officer, General Philip Sheridan. In the letter that accompanied it, he begged Mrs. Custer to accept it as a gift marking her gallant husband's service to the war. Elizabeth Custer wanted all of America to share that opinion. As she said, "I have but one motive, that my husband may be put before our people whenever there is an opportunity." She understood the power and emotion of relics. "I know," she said, "how anything with sentiment attracts the young, whom I am so anxious to gain as admirers of the general." The displays had no interpretation and very little identification. It was enough that visitors could gaze upon the possessions of famous men and contemplate their lives. It was thought that this would help them to become better citizens, and possibly even encourage them to aspire toward greatness themselves. But those rows and rows of displays of men were about to change. Cassie Mason Myers Julian James was a comfortable Washington, D.C. society matron, a philanthropist, a museum enthusiast, and vice president of a chapter of the Colonial Dames of America. In partnership with Rose Gouverneur Hughes, the great-granddaughter of President James Monroe and First Lady Elizabeth Monroe, she created the longest-running and most popular exhibition in the Smithsonian Institution, the First Ladies. It began as a rainy day project. When bad weather kept them confined indoors, James amused her ailing mother by reminiscing about a trunk filled with beautiful clothes and keepsakes that her grandmother had packed away in a New England attic. James and her mother planned to each add an outfit of her own to the trunk, saving the fashions of nearly a century. Mrs. James was a frequent donor to the Smithsonian. When she shared her idea for a personal collection with the staff, they encouraged her to exhibit the collection at the museum. James enthusiastically agreed and proposed expanding the idea to create an exhibition of American historical costume. She turned to her network of well-connected friends for contributions. She soon partnered with Mrs. Hughes, who contributed Monroe family relics and suggesting adding a unique spin to the display by featuring gowns worn by America's first ladies. They got off to a somewhat slow start. An Adams descendant sniffed that his family was not in the habit of keeping old clothes, and recent First Lady Edith Roosevelt didn't understand why the public would clamor to see her dresses. But current First Lady Helen Taft signed on enthusiastically and donated her 1909 inaugural gown. Taft's support encouraged other families to participate. It also set a precedent. In the 100-plus years since the exhibit opened, every First Lady has donated to the collection, and those that attended an inaugural ball donated their gown. The Rainy Day Project opened to the public in 1914, an exhibition of historic costumes featuring the gowns of the mistresses of the White House as a specialty display. The Smithsonian's annual report for 1914 described it as a collection of feminine import, which is quite unique for this country in its largeness of scope, and in part at least for its method of presentation. With few exceptions, this assemblage is illustrative of the fashions of the women of the United States from colonial times, including all manner of accessories and embellishments, and the articles of their particular sphere in the home life. It was a hit. To emphasize the significance of the First Lady's donations, theirs are the only costumes in the exhibition that are displayed on mannequins. But creating mannequins that were cut above the department store variety took time and effort. Following up on a suggestion from the head of the anthropology department that plaster might be better suited to sculpting faces than wax, Mrs. Hughes and Mrs. James worked with Smithsonian staff to create 15 mannequins that consisted of a wood and metal armature, topped by plaster heads and arms. Each figure sports a hairstyle drawn from a First Lady's portrait, but they all have the same face. King Lear's youngest daughter, Cordelia, sculpted by Pierce Francis Connelly in 1865. The bust was a part of the Smithsonian's Fine Arts collection. Mrs. Hughes and Mrs. James were pleased, as was the Smithsonian. The annual report describes the mannequins as exceedingly dignified and wholly commendable. It goes on to say that their work is sculptural, but the delicate ivory tint given the plaster removes all sense of coldness and produces a harmony with the drapery that results in a remarkably pleasing effectiveness. It may have been their dresses that were on display, but the women themselves were chosen to represent presidential administrations, acknowledged as members of presidential administrations. The volunteer curators also gave the Smithsonian its own unique definition of First Lady, based not on marital status, but job function. As defined by Mrs. Hughes and Mrs. James, a First Lady was the woman who served as the official White House hostess during a presidential administration. This could include daughters, daughters-in-law, nieces, and occasionally a family friend. Jane Findlay, the figure on the right, served as the temporary White House hostess during the Harrison administration. As Mrs. Hughes explained, it is not an exhibition of the dresses of the wives of the presidents, but the gowns of the mistresses of the White House. If it were the former, there would be many vacancies in this long line of historical costumes. Finally, famous women had joined the famous men at the Smithsonian Institution, role models for the female visitors to the museum. The exhibition was popular and growing, but so was the tension between the volunteer women curators and the professional museum men. Who would control the First Lady's exhibit? Mrs. James and Mrs. Hughes had built the exhibit through personal contact and outreach, persuading prominent families to lend material for exhibition at the Smithsonian. But as these loans formed through personal connections were converted to official gifts to the institution, Mrs. Hughes and Mrs. James found their influence waning. They continued to work on the exhibit they had created. Mrs. Hughes even wrote a guidebook for the exhibition. But now it seemed they were working on the Smithsonian's exhibit, rather than the Smithsonian hosting theirs. After the deaths of Mrs. James in 1922 and Mrs. Hughes in 1933, the museum had full control of the exhibition, but didn't quite know what to do with it. Concerns about overcrowding and damage to the fragile fabrics meant that the exhibit was relocated several times over the years. The museum men were particularly proud of a 1931 move that placed the display of gowns across the corridor from an installation of mechanical technology and power with a capital P. According to the 1931 annual report, this was providing an attraction for the male visitors and offsetting the feminine display across the hall. While Mrs. Hughes and Mrs. James were making space for the First Ladies, another group of women was bringing in activists. In June of 1919, shortly after the joint resolution for the 19th Amendment was passed by Congress and went out to the states for ratification, Helen Gardner, who was a senior official with the National American Woman Suffrage Association, or NAWSA, approached the Smithsonian with an offer to donate a portrait of Susan B. Anthony. Now, NAWSA had offered Anthony's portrait to the National Collections in 1918, but the male curators had declined the offer, as it was deemed of no special interest to the museum's history collection. A year makes a great deal of difference, though, and in 1919, with suffrage moving to victory, the painting was accepted. According to a memo in the accession file, there now could be no question of the historical importance of the movement initiated by Miss Anthony and now carried out to a successful ending. Mrs. Gardner offered other objects as well, including the table Elizabeth Cady Stanton used when drafting the 1848 Declaration of Sentiments. The museum men agreed amongst themselves that they would accept any artifacts that seemed interesting, but told Mrs. Gardner that they would reserve judgment on the table until she could provide them with the dimensions. As they explained, exhibition space in the museum is already very much overtaxed, and it is therefore necessary to know in advance whether or not an article can be accommodated before it is accepted. Gardner provided the dimensions. The Smithsonian accepted the table. Objects began to arrive in July, causing the museum staff to ask for confirmation from the Secretary's office as to whether the association's plans for a monumental exhibit were agreed to. They were, and the exhibit would include, among other things, Helen Gardner's own copy of the certified joint resolution for the 19th Amendment, along with the gold pen that she had personally provided for the signing ceremony. Material would memorialize NASA leadership, including this Medal for Distinguished Service given to past President Anna Howard Shaw for her war work as chair of the Women's Committee of the Council of National Defense. Shaw died as the donation was being negotiated, but Helen Gardner assured Smithsonian officials that the thought of a display in the National Museum had brought Shaw comfort in her final days. Current President Carrie Chapman Catt was also represented. Mrs. Catt was busy traveling in support of suffrage, but, Gardner assured Curator Theodore Belote, as soon as ratification had reached a point where she could return to Washington, the two of them would come to the Smithsonian and arrange the exhibit. But it was the relics of Susan B. Anthony that were the stars of the collection. In addition to the portrait, it included the trademark red silk shawl she wore to suffrage conventions. It was said that one of the signs of spring in Washington, D.C. was when Susan B. Anthony's red shawl was once more seen in the halls of the Capitol as she lobbied congressmen for suffrage. A cup and saucer from the tea service she purchased as a gift for her mother with the first paycheck she earned as a teacher, as well as the gold watch and chain she purchased for herself. It included tributes to Anthony, like the silver loving cup given to her on her 80th birthday by members of the Colorado Equal Suffrage Association, and the gold enamel and diamond flag pin that was also an 80th birthday gift from the women of Wyoming. In her lifetime, Susan B. Anthony was one of the most recognizable leaders of the suffrage movement. Her work as a women's rights organizer, speaker, agitator, lobbyist, and mentor had made her famous, and reviled or admired by different audiences. Her books chronicling the suffrage movement and a commissioned biography fostered the image of Anthony as singularly devoted to women's suffrage. After her death, that image and her memory were invoked to bolster her successor's claims to leadership of the movement. For all intents and purposes, Susan B. Anthony was the patron saint of women's suffrage. The deification of Anthony was so complete that she began to be credited with things she hadn't actually done. When she and her colleague Elizabeth Cady Stanton founded the suffrage periodical The Revolution, Stanton served as the editor, and Anthony worked as the business manager. But the slip of paper inside this inkstand identifies Anthony as the editor, not Stanton. Elizabeth Cady Stanton eventually gave the table on which she drafted the Declaration of Sentiments to Susan B. Anthony as a gift. Anthony later brought it out at suffrage conventions, and it became associated with her. When it was first displayed at the museum, the table was incorrectly identified as Miss Anthony's table, even though Susan B. Anthony had not attended the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention and was not yet a suffragist. By the fall of 1919, the Smithsonian was ready to place the objects on exhibition, but NASA told them to wait. They wanted the exhibit opening to coincide with the ratification of the 19th Amendment. So a year later, in the fall of 1920, and joined by a few last-minute objects, like the pen used to sign the ratification, the NASA collection went on display. The Smithsonian's annual report refers to it as Mementos of Susan B. Anthony and Objects Illustrating the History of the Women's Suffrage Movement in the United States from 1848 to 1919. The exhibit is an amazing example of women proudly claiming a place in the National Museum, determining how their story will be told and what they want remembered about their achievements. The men of the museum did not quite realize that with that polite offer of a portrait, the women of NASA were really saying, "This is what we've achieved. Now where's our spot?" In many ways, the collection is the material culture equivalent to the 6-volume history of women's suffrage written by Anthony Stanton, Matilda Jocelyn Gage, and Ida Husted Harper. The authors solicited accounts of the suffrage movement from women across the country and then compiled and edited them to emphasize Stanton, Anthony, and NASA's role as leaders of a coordinated campaign for voting rights. Their work established the traditional story of the suffrage movement, and the exhibit at the Smithsonian reinforced it. Anthony's niece Lucy called the display at the Smithsonian the crowning glory to everything. Helen Gardner sent the Smithsonian very specific instructions about the collection. Above all else, she wrote, "This exhibit be kept altogether in the most suitable place you can prepare for it, because these few things that we have sent will not be the end of the historic collection to show the origin and development of the greatest bloodless revolution ever known, the achieving of political and financial independence by 1/2 of the people without a drop of blood being shed, and until about 4 years ago, without even the shadow of discreditable conduct traced to those who were engaged in the work. Therefore, there is now one other request besides the above, which Dr. Shaw, Miss Anthony, and all of us would want to make very definite, and that is that this exhibit shall be kept free now and at all times from anything that might connect it in any way with the lawlessness of a few women who were never a part of the national and international movement." Those lawless women would be Alice Paul and the members of the National Woman's Party. In 1912, Alice Paul, who had traveled to England as a graduate student, became involved in the British suffragette movement led by Emmeline Pankhurst. She returned to America determined to energize the American suffrage movement with the confrontational techniques she had learned from British suffragettes. Establishing the Congressional Union within NASA, she both inspired and irritated its leaders. In 1917, Paul formed the National Woman's Party, and the two organizations became bitter rivals. The battle for credit continued after the exhibit was opened. In 1922, Helen Gardner heard a rumor that Alice Paul would approach the Smithsonian and ask that the Declaration of Sentiments table be removed from exhibit and given to her. Gardner sprang into action and contacted the Smithsonian herself. As she later told Lucy Anthony, "I told them that I had received a letter saying that Alice Paul's organization had advertised that it was going to have the table upon which the Bill of Rights was written for women, and asked him what he knew about it. He said he had not heard anything of the kind, and that no one could ever withdraw any article from the Smithsonian except by order of those who had placed it there. I knew that she was fully capable of sending them a letter signed by Mrs. Catt, and therefore I told him that the exhibit had been placed there by the National Suffrage Association through Mrs. Catt and myself, and there could never be any question as to either of us permitting that association of women to withdraw any article whatsoever, that we had never approved of any of their methods, plans, nor conduct, and that we did not wish to be in any way whatsoever associated with them. Of course, he knew this long ago, but I thought he might have forgotten. He says that so far as he knows, there has been no such request made, but if such a request should be made, it would not be granted without the signature of those who had placed the article there." NASA's narrowly focused display would define the Smithsonian's narrative of women's suffrage for decades. Beginning in the 1960s, curators like Keith Melder and Edith Mayo began expanding the collection, not just to include both suffrage organizations, but the women of all classes and races across the United States who had worked for women's suffrage and women's rights. To mark the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, we're reinterpreting the NASA collection to talk about who is remembered and why they're remembered, who's left out of the story, and how the anniversary of a movement can be joyous, inspirational, disappointing, a call to action, and a cautionary tale, all at the same time. And for anyone worrying about what happened to the First Ladies exhibit, in 1943, it found its way into the capable hands of Margaret Brown Klapthor, who couldn't believe her luck. "Here is the most popular exhibit in the museum," she recalled. "Really the prize collection, too. And it was being, none of the men in the division cared about it at all. It was just being casually tossed off to a museum technician type who was coming in direct from college." Klapthor recognized not only the popularity, but the potential of the First Ladies exhibit. She installed more lifelike mannequins and increasingly elaborate period room settings, modeled after historic rooms in the White House and incorporating architectural elements salvaged from the Truman renovation of the mansion. Klapthor's decorative arts approach linked changes in fashion, architecture, and design to the changes in American democracy. The exhibit remained one of the most popular attractions at the Smithsonian Institution. When a museum construction project necessitated the removal of the period rooms, and several gowns were retired from view for conservation work, new curator Edie Mayo was able to take the exhibit in new directions. 1992's First Ladies' political role and public image shifted the focus to the women's evolving roles and contributions to American politics and culture. It examined First Ladies' contributions as social advocates, hostesses, political campaigners, and presidential partners. The current version of the exhibit concentrates on how First Ladies approach this unofficial but important job without a description. 100 years after Mrs. Hughes, Mrs. James, and Mrs. Gardner, First Ladies and activists still play a large part in how the Smithsonian exhibits women. And let's see what people had to ask. Now this is one I get a lot. Which of the First Ladies' donations is your favorite? Now, my stock answer is that I say that is like asking someone to choose between their children. So I tend not to answer, but for this group, I'm going to say that one of my favorite dresses is Helen Taft's inaugural gown. Partly because it's the first dress that came into the collection. It really started the collection off. And also because it's an incredible silver, beautiful white gown embroidered in silver, although it now looks like it's embroidered in copper because of the changes that have happened over time. And just on, those wonderful flukes that just happen and make things interesting. That was Helen Taft's 1909 inaugural gown. When we were putting together a new installation of the exhibition in 2010 and getting ready, we were going through all kinds of construction. So the First Ladies collection kept moving. The exhibit kept moving into these little temporary galleries. And we were doing a version in 2010, and that would be the version into which the Obama gown came. And it was so wonderful. We had the Taft gown on display. The collection had been up now for about 100 years. We were opening it we were going to open it for this wonderful, momentous thing. And we had the collection, the dress that started the collection, this beautiful white gown embroidered in silver with a long train. And with it, on a fluke, 100 years later, in 2009, the incoming First Lady wore a beautiful white dress embroidered in silver with a long train. And we hadn't seen a train for decades. So it's an amazing pairing, these two dresses, which make them both favorites of mine. I'm also very fond of a pearl necklace of Abigail Adams. They're fake pearls, because as we know, all women in their jewelry box someplace have a strand of fake pearls. They were called Roman pearls. They were made of blown glass, so they're incredibly fragile, little hollow glass balls, and they're treated with iridescent fish scales. And that's what makes them look like pearls. One of my favorite things to pair them with is Jacqueline Kennedy's fake pearls, because again, all women have fake pearls somewhere. Let's see. Oh, somebody's telling us Mary Ellen Matisse. What a great thing to know that Mrs. Carter wore a dress designed and manufactured by my aunt, Mary Matisse, and I never pronounce the firm correctly, Hime, I think is how you say it. And that is a wonderful dress. It's a great story, too, because Mrs. Carter got that dress for a gubernatorial ball when her husband Jimmy was elected governor of Georgia, and she wore it for that for that inaugural ball. And she says that she decided when they were running for president that if they won, she was going to wear that dress again because it was a sentimental favorite. And, she got some flack for doing that because people tend to think that it should be a whole new gown. And, Mrs. Carter did not realize that part of her job was going to be having new clothes and promoting American fashion. I think it's a wonderful sentimental choice. And the amazing thing about this dress, it has a sort of long overcoat, sleeveless overcoat to it, a covering piece that's a beautiful gold, sort of a brocade, or you think it's brocade. But when we were doing high definition photography for a video in the exhibition, we were turning all of the gowns in turn on Lazy Susans, essentially big spinning First Ladies gowns. And we were doing it in a blocked off part of the exhibition while all of the visitors for the day could watch us as we performed this video function. And we kept coming back when we were filming the Carter gown. We kept looking at the monitor and then going over to look at the dress because we couldn't believe it was real. The over layer looks very solid. It looks like brocade. But when we had that high intensity photography on it, we realized that it's sheer. It's this wonderful woven concoction of gold that you don't get what it looks like when you're looking at it without that high definition. And so it's an amazing thing in the exhibition. You can see the dress itself, you can see photographs of the dress, and then you can see what it looks like in this high definition photography. So it really gives you these wonderful different looks at the dress. So I hope that you can come and see your aunt's dress on display soon. Let's see. Question is, do you think that the exhibit today would display these objects differently, or perhaps reframe the narrative around these items? Well, what I think we found for both these collections is that that's exactly what we do. Things are donated in their place and time, and they're donated with an intent to be saved for history. But also the narrative focus is the point of view of curators at the time or of the public at the time, what they're interested in. And so as time goes on, especially with a collection this old, how we think about First Ladies' roles, how we think about suffrage changes. And so right now, the exhibition, instead of having all the dresses in chronological order, it mixes up dresses with other objects. And it talks about how different First Ladies approach this job. And we use things like beautiful gowns, which were collected to show, just to represent an administration or to show fashion. We can use them as a springboard to talk about how a First Lady deals with her job, what the job is like, and go on to other topics. The NASA collection is specifically donated to solidify the memory of one group of people and their achievements. Now, what we can do is mix it up with more recent objects, or as we have done in the exhibit, our current suffrage exhibit, how we were creating icons, how we remember women's suffrage. We pair it with two modern collections. The material that curators out in the field collected from the 1977 National Women's Conference in Houston, Texas, and the 2017 Women's March out on the Mall. And we compare it with those objects from those particular collections to talk about how women's suffrage and the memory of suffrage and the ways that suffrage, the tactics used in achieving suffrage, how the glory, the things that were positive about it and the things that were negative about it, how they reverberated into modern women's activism. So the NASA collection interacts with these other objects to tell different stories. And that's one of the most fascinating things about being a museum curator, about working in history through this medium, is that anytime you put two things together, anytime you juxtapose two different things, you tell a different story. And When you have a collection of hundreds of thousands of objects, you have endless stories that you can tell. Let's see. One question is, what an incredible collection and legacy. Does this collection change with each presidency? That's the First Lady's. Or how often are items switched out since there's so many beautiful objects? Well, definitely with each new presidential administration, we request, and so far have always been honored with a new donation representing the First Lady. There's a first donation, which usually, as part of the tradition, marks that inauguration. And then as the years go on, what we look to do is document the First Lady's work as First Lady and her time as First Lady. So the exhibit changes a little because we only have a certain amount of room. So a new dress comes on, and that means something is pulled out. We also have long-term plans over time, and that includes trading out what we call the particular stories that we tell. We have a section in the back of the exhibit as you exit the show that after we've set you up with the idea of the roles of the First Lady, that looks at particularly, call them the case studies, that talks about particular First Ladies. And those we we hope to change out at regular intervals. The interesting, one of the challenges of being the Smithsonian is that people plan visits to us, and they sometimes it takes them a few years to plan and be able to come. So where local music, a lot of museums can change things out reasonably quickly, we tend to want to try and keep things on exhibit a little longer so that when we've announced that something, you can come and see something, we allow time for people to plan, say, a trip from California with their grandchildren to come and see the exhibition. So we like to allow a little more buffer time. Let's see. Are there any First Ladies that are particularly responsive to this collection, whether donating a large amount of their own or other important objects in women's history? I would say that all of the First Ladies, certainly that I have worked with, that the records show any my predecessors have worked with, are very responsive to the collection. They even though they're the First Lady of the United States, the idea of being represented in the Smithsonian is still sort of awe-inspiring to people, that you're going to be forever somewhere for people to see. There's a wonderful story about Lady Bird Johnson, who, of course, was a congressional wife for years before she became First Lady, and was very familiar with the exhibition because she took visitors, constituents, tours through the museum and through the First Lady's exhibition. And her gown, her inaugural gown, is very plain. It's a very plain yellow satin with a yellow satin coat trimmed with fur-trimmed sleeves. And she made a remark at the time that all the beautiful trimmed, embroidered, beaded dresses were lovely, but they wouldn't stand the test of time. And she was familiar enough with the exhibit and what was going to happen to that dress that she chose something very plain that she thought would hold up. And we are thankful to her for that, or have been on many occasions. Let's see, someone's asking, what's the percentage of objects in the collection that are on display at a single time? Oh gosh, the number for the museum, sort of our rule of thumb number, is that about 1% of the collection overall for the Smithsonian is on exhibit at any one time. I'd say for the First Lady's collection, that's a little higher because it's a dedicated show and the collection is simply smaller, sort of proportionally. We try, because you saw those amazing skylights in one of the early slides. Because of concerns for damage, we do try and change things over. And the nice thing about having a smaller gallery right now, as opposed to what at one time was 9,000 square feet, is it means that we can change the objects, which gives them a longer lifespan. One of the amazing things about First Lady's exhibit, I've said amazing quite a few times now, because it's so old, it's over 100 years old now, people have memories of coming with their grandparents to see the exhibit. What we want is for the objects to retain enough life that those people, that the grandchildren you bring now will be able to bring their grandchildren, and that there will be something to see. And if we keep the exhibit moving and lively, they'll be able to do that. Let's see. Is Susan B. Anthony's red shawl still on display? And it is right now. It is on display in Creating Icons, How We Remember Women's Suffrage. And so when the museum is open again, that shawl will be available for people to see in this wonderful anniversary year. But because it is fragile, it will then be, when we take the exhibit down, it will be off exhibit for a while and will only come out for special occasions. Let's see. Somebody said this, so fascinating, thank you. Oh, it moved up the screen and now there we go. Had there been any exhibits like this done before, dedicated specifically to women's history? And there have, over time in the institution, there have been dedicated shows either to suffrage or the accomplishments of women. From Julia Child's Kitchen to exhibits on suffrage, to exhibits on women printers, to exhibits on women in war efforts, women's activism, women in entertainment. We like to do a combination of things that are specific to women, and then have women be a part of larger exhibitions. And the nice thing about a place like the National Museum is that it's large enough that you can do both. A truly thrilling museum has very broad-based exhibits where everyone shows up. And with that, to supplement, it has smaller shows that can look at a particularly focused area, and that can be the contributions of a particular group of people. It can be a very specific story like women's suffrage, or it can be a specific type of object. We had a beautiful show in the gallery where Creating Icons is now. There was a beautiful show on crazy quilts, silk crazy quilts. So it talked about the women who had made those quilts, the women who created the fabrics that made those quilts, and what they said about women's history. So it's a wonderful combination of exhibits that make the museum a fascinating place to be and a really good place to visit. How do you think the physical arrangement of the objects affects the viewer's experience and understanding of the exhibition? I think it's all about, as I was saying earlier, it's all about juxtaposition. It's obviously the interpretive slant that the particular curator puts on the exhibition, because one particular object can be interpreted any number of ways depending upon the story that you're trying to tell, and they all tell different stories. But the magic is in the combination. So if you combine Susan B. Anthony's shawl with Nannie Helen Burroughs, who's a wonderful African-American activist who also established a school in Washington, D.C., if you put those things together, you tell a very different story than if you put together Susan B. Anthony's shawl and just Elizabeth Cady Stanton's table. So it's the wonderful juxtaposition of materials that allow you to tell different stories. I'm sorry, I was reading to myself. What a remarkable story. Looking forward to the future. How do you see this collection changing or staying the same as it continues? I'm going to assume that's about the First Lady's collection, but I don't know. So we're going to make the assumption that that's First Lady's and say that I think that the collection will go, I think that parts of it will remain, I don't want to say the same. I think that parts of the exhibit or the collection will continue the tradition, because it's a lovely tradition, isn't it? That the inaugural gown or something from the inauguration is preserved in the collection, because really that's the First Lady's first appearance on the stage in that role, in the national stage in that role as First Lady of the United States. So that's a wonderful thing to continue to document. It's a wonderful thing to be part of a tradition that goes on for that long. But with that, we also want all those materials that were collected in 1909 that tell you about the work that the First Lady does. So it will partly, as many things, it will stay a little bit the same, and then it will move into other directions. Let's see. Can you share how you have added objects to the collection? Can you talk about your favorite new acquisition before the pandemic closed the museum? Oh gosh. My favorite, well, we add material to the museum mostly by donation, but in political history we also go out and collect in the field. So we're out at protests, we're out at political conventions and campaigns. So we bring in things in a multitude of ways, all of which create different flavors to the collection and allow it to stay very current. And it's before the pandemic. It's almost hard to remember. Okay, I am one that we have on exhibit. One of my favorite acquisitions before the pandemic was a gavel. Very classic object, a gavel. But gavels are symbols of power and authority. And women didn't have gavels early on because they didn't have power and authority. They begin to have gavels in their own possession in the late 19th and early 20th century when they start women's organizations and clubs and move into leadership. And we have a beautiful rosewood and ivory gavel that was Susan B. Anthony's. And before the pandemic, we acquired the gavel that was given to Nancy Pelosi when she became the first woman to be the Speaker of the United States House of Representatives. And if you study women in politics, that's a pretty big moment. The first time that a woman wielded a gavel in that position and in that place. So that to me is a favorite. And it's also in the Creating Icons exhibit as we talk about the changes that happened in the 100 years since suffrage. Let's see. Someone asks, there was a controversy involved with this is about this is more about Rosalind Carter's dress. It says there was a controversy involved with the credits. A male design assistant claimed that he did it, not so. It was interesting. Oh, the caftan is. Thank you. The word was not coming to me. All I could think of was overcoat. Well, that is very interesting. Thank you for letting me know that. We'll take a look at the catalog records. And that's one of the other nice things about a museum is the catalog records we keep adding to them so that more information can be added over time to keep the objects current. Let's see. Hello, Allison from the Alice Paul Institute. Can you speak a bit more about how the interpretation of the women's suffrage movement has had to evolve from NASA to Alice Paul to the women of color who had to create their own organizations to work for equality? Well, I think that the biggest thing about the interpretation, obviously, if you look at that 100-year-old collection, was that when it first comes into the museum, it's all about the NASA. It's all about NASA because it's, they always say the people who win write the history. And NASA was determined that they would be the winners and they would write the history. Now, what's interesting, one of the things that I find interesting is that in many ways, they won the battle and lost the war. Because it is, if you only learn a very traditional version of suffrage, the one that we mostly learned in school, you learn about Susan B. Anthony. You probably have never even heard of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, but you learn Susan B. Anthony is the name that you know. But one of the things I found fascinating in the last couple of years is that the image people have of suffrage, however, is Alice Paul. The image that they have are the pickets in front of the White House for those militants, those troublemaking women, lawless women that NASA was determined would not have the credit. So somewhere they merged this idea of Susan B. Anthony, but the militants, which in one way must have driven NASA crazy or would have driven NASA crazy. In another way, it just shows how the truth will out and how stories open up so that everyone can be included. Now, Edie Mayo, and Keith Melder in the 1960s and 1970s worked to begin collecting material that told these other stories about women of color, about these other organizations, to include them in the collection and give us those tools to tell stories as time goes on. And so Creating Icons right now works very hard to tell, not just to note these other women, to tell their stories, but to explain why they weren't remembered in the first place, which, partly has to do with claiming credit and partly has to do with the tactics, some of the tactics that were used to fight for suffrage. Some of which could become exclusionary, some of which became racist, some of which became classist. And one of the things we want people to remember is that how you win, the memory of how you win, comes forward along with what you win, so that all of these objects have multiple layers of memory just adhered to them. And so they're seen by different people in different ways. What to one person is joyous and celebratory can be seen by someone else as exclusionary or disappointing, but they all make up the story together. And so if we can put them together, if we can talk about the way that they're viewed by different people, we can create a stronger whole. And what we hope is that it will help us understand that way everyone else is seeing it, understand everyone else's point of view, and be able to work together more in the future, both as women, as women's organizations, and as an American people. Let's see. Someone is saying, I have a PowerPoint presentation of the First Lady's costume, and the gowns of Louisa Adams and Abigail Fillmore have no good photographs. Have the gowns been recently photographed so that the virtual tour can see the gowns more clearly? It depends. I don't know how old your photographs are. I would say that the last photographs of those gowns were probably made, you can see me calculating in my head, were probably made when the old period rooms were taken down in 1987, 88, and that large conservation work on the gowns began. I tell you what, if you can get in touch with me. If you get in touch with me, I'll put in the chat my email. And if you email me, when we all get back into the building, I can see if we have recent photographs. Let's see. Someone is asking, so we now have a first gentleman. How will you incorporate him into your interpretations? Well, we don't have a what we have is a male spouse for the vice president. And the vice presidents have never been part of this collection. So at the moment, we are hoping to collect around Vice President Kamala Harris as the first woman to hold that position. Collecting the spouses of the vice president has never been a part of the tradition at the Smithsonian. But it's certainly something that we'll think about and see if it, I had a colleague who always used to say, if it recommends itself to us, to see if that's something that could be started. But we are very excited to talk about the first woman to be vice president. And I see the comment under it. I spoke too soon, said we may have soon. We may have soon. And what we will do is take a cue, and this is a label in the exhibit exactly. I've lost vocabulary today. This is also a label in the exhibit. What we will do is see how this role plays out in an administration where the presidential spouse is a man. Because the collection itself, as I said, Mrs. Hughes and Mrs. James created the collection as a, knowingly or not, created it as based not on matrimonial status, but as the person who played a particular role. What will be interesting to see is who plays that role and how that role is handled in an administration. So I would say that we will watch to see what happens and collect as it is appropriate for that new administration. I'm interested to see what happens then. I'm really interested to see what happens in the first administration after that, where the first lady, the spouse would flip back to being a woman, or moves back to being a woman, and to see if that creates any changes in the role as well. If changing it back and forth will create a new version of the First Lady's role. Let's see. Do you ever have challenges with older collections and their collection agreements and reinterpreting new items in the exhibit? That is a very interesting question. And I would say that this is shifting and I can't then see the question as I've moved it. There we go. That's interesting. We tend to take objects. Our goal is to take objects with no restrictions on them so that we can use them as we need to. With the older collections, what mostly came in is in the agreement itself, is that it would stay together. And that, of course, changed 100 years ago when the museum itself physically changed. And those are usually verbal agreements, or they are noted someplace. But in a world before deeds, I can hear our registrar in the back of my mind saying, "You don't know what you're talking about." But I would say the conventions under which old donations were made and new donations are made are just very different. And we didn't have deeds of gift and contracts in the old days. So things came in and assumptions were made about how they would be used. But, things have had to change with the times. And a lot of those older collections also were loans that when they were turned over into gifts and accessions, different conditions are put on them. What we try to do is do our best by the collection to honor the intent of the donor to have objects and the people whom they represent remembered. We can't always guarantee that we're going to remember them the way that maybe you want or use them the way that they would have wanted. Because again, we find out new things all the time, and our first priority is to tell true history, which can sometimes be a little bit in contrast with people who were with an older tradition, which was establishing collections to honor a very specific memory. And our job is to use those materials and to continue to honor that memory the best way we can. And the way we can do that is by telling true history in all of its aspects. When the Smithsonian builds its planned museum dedicated to women, will exhibits like those you focused on remain at the American History Museum or be transferred to the new museum? Well, that's an excellent question. And my assumption is that these collections and these exhibits will stay at the National Museum of American History, just like the collections related to African American history have stayed at the National Museum of American History, even while the National Museum of African American History and Culture has become our partner and our sister organization next door. What these museums do is supplement each other and complement each other. And there's so many stories to tell, so many collections and stories out there that we can all focus, we can all share them. We can all work together, have parts of them, and tell different stories. So that's an exciting thing for us, especially as the idea is one Smithsonian, and one Smithsonian has many parts that work together to tell stories. As I move up, let's see. Do you have a military veterans advisor for the military history exhibition? Gosh, I am not a part of the military history collection, but I do know that I don't know if they have an established panel, but I do know that they widely consult with people they need to, and when they're working on both exhibitions and collecting. What do you hope to collect from the first female vice president? The flip answer is to say everything I can get my hands on. Just partly true and partly me dodging a question. We don't talk about donations while we're working on them for just obvious reasons that we don't want to set expectations or assumptions about what will come in. We look forward to working with Vice President Harris and her staff to talk about the best ways to represent her in the institution. Do you foresee the role disappearing or altering so significantly that it no longer resembles the original intent of the collection? I'm going to assume that means the First Ladies. It will be interesting to see how the First Ladies alters. I, for one, would love to get rid of the name First Ladies. It's a very 19th century turn of phrase that was really about a social structure. The First Lady is the First Lady of the land, the First Lady of the social order, and that's not really a germane title anymore. So I'm not a big fan of calling a man the first gentleman. I think we just need to start referring to it as the President Biden and Dr. Biden, Vice President Harris and Mr. Emhoff. I think that as we start focusing much more, as we are focusing much more on the role and the job that the people in these positions do, I think that the honorifics are not as important. So it'll be interesting to see what titles people choose to use, and if society sort of changes those, if society exerts pressure to change those titles, or if it's just, you know, one of those things we continue to revert to, no matter what, because it's a comfort and a tradition. But I think that the roles have evolved. There's a core of the role that has remained the same, and that is the idea of the presidential spouse being the nation's hostess. I think everything else, the political aspect, the public relations aspect, all that has been added on to that. And that really starts from a place of being the host and hostess in your own home, and then welcoming visitors, congressional, diplomatic, into the country, and setting that diplomatic national stage. That's been going on since the beginning, partly because you couldn't entertain in mixed company without a hostess, so a hostess was necessary, and partly for that soft diplomacy, or what we tend to call soft diplomacy. That, to me, is going to be one of the most interesting things to see if it remains or changes, or if that becomes a more professionalized function. You'll always be the host and hostess in your own home, but whether you retain some of that official planning role, it'll be interesting to see how that works. Okay, I think that looks, oh my goodness, and I'm over time. It's 11:32, and that looks like all of the questions, which have been very interesting to me. So thank you for such a lively interest in the collection, and for sharing this time with me. And now we're going to take a little bit of a break.